Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulihil kareem. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our next lesson in the beginner level of Tajweed, where we will wrap up our discussion on the single letter. So far we've gone through the importance of every single letter and what kind of makes up a single letter, its origination point, its characteristics. We've went through some of the characteristics in the last video when we were talking about the makharij. In this video is just additional topics when it comes to the single letter, such as different ways that they can look. We'll go through some of the similar sounding letters and end off with practicing some words that students usually found difficult. So let's start by looking at similar letters. Some of these letters are similar in appearance, but mainly they're similar in sound, so we want to differentiate how and why they're different. Starting off in the top right corner, we have alif and ayn. So more specifically, we have alif with the fatha, which we said last time, it's actually hamza with the fatha, and hamza doesn't have its own sound, it just makes the sound of the vowel, and so this would be a. Then we have ayn and hamza. Ayn comes from the middle of the throat, makes a constricted sound, it's not deep or heavy, so you smile when you say it. It just adds to the vowel a constricted sound, so instead of saying a, we would say a. That's how those two differ. One is simply like an a, the other one has constriction. The next two are ha versus ha, oftentimes mistaken. They both can be represented with an H in the English language, but ha on the left here is more similar to that because there's no constriction when you recite that. So what I mean by that is this is ha, and ha, you make that extra straining sound when you pronounce it, versus ha, which is like a normal H, like when you say hi. So that's how those two differ. Just like hamza and ayn, ha and ha differ by their construction. Next, looking at jim and zai. So jim fatha is ja and zai fatha is za, and they don't really sound like each other if you're pronouncing it correctly, but like I said, some people naturally pronounce jim like jim, and in that case I guess the jim could be jim fatha ja, which sounds a little bit like za and might sound similar sounding, but again, if you're pronouncing jim without softness, which is what would make it the ja, it has shidda or hardness, then it would be ja, not dragging the consonant sound. Down here we're looking at kind of the same letters, so starting with ghain and kha. We talked about this in depth in the last lesson, so I would recommend looking at that video. But when compared to each other, ghain has a more gh sound, kha has a more kh sound. You can compare it to like a G versus a KH, but they both come from the top of the throat and they're both heavy as suggested by this dot on top. So you frown for both kha fatha kha and ghain fatha gha. Qaf and kha are the next ones that we compared in depth in the previous video. Again, they come from neighboring makharij. Kha has softness, qaf has hardness, so kha you would stretch out or drag the consonant sound, and qaf is more wet sounding, and ghain and qaf would be different for the same exact reasons. Moving on to the left side of this chart, so tha is the first one, and sin is the second letter. Tha fatha is tha, and sin fatha is sa. And I mentioned that sometimes tha sounds a little bit like there's an S sound in there, that's why it's spelled it that way, but you don't want to add a whistling sound to tha. That's the main difference between these two. Sin has a whistle, sin, sa, but if you add that to a tha and say tha, then it's crossing over into sin territory. So the main difference between these two in sound is the whistle. So tha, it's not tha, you don't want to go the other way, but tha comes from the tip of the tongue at the edge of the upper central incisors. Tha, and you can see your tongue sticking out when you say tha. Next to tha and sheen, they don't really sound alike, they more so look alike, and I mentioned this in the last video as well. They both have 3 dots, but tha, and you can see side by side now, has that 1 scoop, and sheen has the 2 under the dots. And that'll be important when recognizing them when sheen appears without the tail at the end. And then we have the comparison between sin and sheen. The difference is that sheen has that SH sound, while sin has that whistle. Again, sheen should not have the whistle, and that's a differentiating factor between the two. Sin and Sad, however, are more commonly mistaken. So sin fatha would be sa, And Sad with the fatha being a heavy letter, we frown and say aw, like awesome, and we would say saw, not sa like seen would be, but saw. That's the main difference between these two. Even if Sad has kasra, let's take for example, Sin kasra would be si, and Sad kasra would be si. Tongue still rises, fills the mouth, but it's a lighter version of the heaviness, and you get si. The listener should be able to tell, are you saying si or are you saying si? And there should be a clear differentiation. Like when we're saying ihdina sirata, not ihdina sirat, that would be incorrect. For similar reasons, ta and ta, like we mentioned in the last video, are different as well. Ta is essentially the heavy version of ta. Ta you smile, ta you frown. Ta. Same thing with these next two letters. Dhal, smiling, coming from, again, the edge of the upper central incisors touching the tip of the tongue. Dhal. And dha, same place, tongue is still there, will come, but the tongue is now filling the mouth and risen. Dha. And of course, you don't forget to smile. Dha. Then let's compare these last two. Dha and dad. They actually look similar. They have this same type of head shape with a dot on top on both. And they're both heavy. Dha and dad. The way that they're different though, however, is that dha has that kind of Z sound to it. V, that comes from placing your tongue at the edge of the teeth like that. V, while dad will not stick out. When you say dad, it will not stick out of the mouth. Again, just as a reminder, dad comes from the side of the tongue, the upturned back edge of the tongue, touching the molars on one side or the other side. Or both sides. Dad. So if it crosses the teeth, then you get a similar sounding sound, vad, but that's why it's important to not let dad cross the teeth. Now let's look at letter variants. Now depending on the script of Quran you use, either Uthmani or Indo-Pak, both are good, but the way that they write the letters can sometimes differ. That's one way that these letters vary. Another way that letters vary is depending on where they come in the word. If you start a word with a certain letter, or that letter appears in the middle of that word or appears at the end of the word, it can look different in all three phases. And this is what's called an identity map. If you just look up Arabic letter variants or variations of the Arabic alphabet, you'll find many different resources online to help you memorize and recognize what letter you're looking at. If you come across something in the Quran, you're like, is this still Arabic? But chances are it's just a different way to write the letter depending on the positioning in the wording. So this particular diagram is from Safa Publications. They actually have a very good qaida for kids and beginners to learn from, and I would highly recommend checking them out. They also have a bunch of free resources online that you can use too. This is where I got this chart. I like the way it looked. It's not comprehensive. They also have an advanced identity map where they have even more variations and iterations of these letters. But just for an example, let's take a look at meme here. So by itself, meme can look like that. At the beginning of a word, it would look like that. At the middle of a word, it would look like that. And at the end of a word, it can look like that. Depends on the script too. Sometimes in the middle of the word, it can appear kind of like that. And sometimes it's confused with ha, but ha will have two heads. Ha will have one going up and one going down from that middle line. So I would take time to kind of go through this chart and look at the different variants. Kaf especially, kaf by itself looks like that. But at the beginning of a word, it can look like this. In the middle of the word, looks like that. And at the end of the word, looks like that. So it depends on the positioning of kaf. One place a lot of students get confused is when there is either a jim, ha, or kha in the middle of a word. Then usually a dotted letter or a one scoop letter like ba, da, tha, or ya even, when they're on top of these letters, let's take jim for example, then that letter will have an inverted or upside down scoop, and the dots will be either like that, or if we're looking at ya, then the dots will be down here, and it can get confusing. Do these dots go to this letter or do they go to that letter? Typically, they'll make it clear which dots come first. So if 2 dots come first, then that will go to this first letter. And if 1 dot comes first, then it'll go to the first letter here. So if it's 2 dots, it'll be ya, and 1 dot will be ba underneath, etc. And we'll see more examples of this down the line. These are the 6 letters that do not connect, do not join to the letter after them. So you can see that when they're alone, they look like this, but they don't look like anything in the beginning or the middle because they don't connect to anything else. They will always be at the end or by themselves. And you just kind of have to memorize those. Now let's practice some difficult words. In the last lesson, we went through all of the heavy versus light versus sometimes heavy, sometimes light letters. This is just in mnemonic. It goes khussa, baghdin, qilv. Kind of a mouthful because they're literally full mouth letters, so it's hard to say. But khussa, baghdin, qilv. You just have to say it a bunch of times. Khussa, baghdin, qilv. Doesn't really mean anything. It's kind of like Roy G. Biv. But once you get it down, then you can remember, okay, these are the 7 heavy letters. Everything else is not heavy, or alif, lam, ra are the 3, sometimes heavy, sometimes light. And I've written out the letters here. So let's practice some of these difficult words. So they're difficult because you have to transition from heavy to light, back to heavy, or back to light, and that's what makes it kind of a linguistic acrobatics, if you will. And a lot of students have trouble with this because they're not used to this. And in normal Arabic speech, if we weren't reading the Quran, then we wouldn't do this. You would just kind of apply the heaviness of one letter to the next letter depending on the positioning. But again, when we're reading the Quran, and I keep emphasizing this, every letter must be given its due right. So if one letter is heavy, then keep it heavy. If the next letter is light, don't make it heavy because the letter before was heavy. Let's look at some examples. So the first one here, we have va, heavy, with a fatha. So va, we'll take the consonant sound, and then we will add the fatha sound, which is a, so va. And then we have the a sound, but on heavy letters, it's actually a. So we end up kind of with the same thing that we had, but it's not va, it's short, va, va. Next we have lam in the middle here. It's not alif because alif doesn't connect. So this is heavy, va. This is lam, fatha. We just want the consonant sound, l, plus the fatha sound, a, and we're left with la. Lastly, we have the mim with a fatha. So take the consonant sound, add the fatha sound. It's light, so we keep it like that, and it's ma. So we have va, la, ma. And oftentimes people say valama or valama, or they'll make the va light and say valama, but it's valama, valama. The next word, we only see half the head, but this is kha. Kha, we know is heavy. We just want the first sound, and just like va we just saw, the fatha will be kind of like the ah, like awesome. We end up with the same thing, but it's not kha like long, it's kha, short. Kha. Second letter here, again, lam. Lam, fatha, like we said, is la. Then we have qaf, not khaf, but qaf. Take the first consonant sound, add the ah because it's heavy, one of the heavy letters, and we get qa, short because it's a short vowel. And lastly, we have the letter kaf. Kaf, take the first consonant sound, add the a of the fatha, it'll stay a because it's light letter, and we get ka. So we have kha, la, qa, ka. Heavy, light, heavy, light. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've heard this recited khalaqaka. Khala, la. We're making the lam heavy because it's sandwiched between these two heavy letters. But no, lam will be light because it's light in this scenario. Khalaqaka. I said in the last video that it'll only be heavy in the name of Allah, and that lesson is coming soon where we look at the conditions why. Next, let's start by labeling these letters first. So we have fa, light, then we have qaf, heavy, then we have dal, and then we have ra. Now, I said earlier, alif, lam, ra are sometimes heavy, sometimes light. Ra with fatha or dhamma is heavy, and with kasra it's light. Ra has a whole set of rules on further explanations on when it's heavy and light, but for now, that's a simple version of it. So here it's heavy. So fa fatha fa, qa fatha qa, qa heavy, dal fatha da, and ra fatha ra. So putting it all together, fa qa da ra, na faqadara or faqadara. Not making all of them heavy or all of them light, going back and forth, giving each letter its due right. Faqadara. Lastly, we have hamza fatha a, qa fatha like we said, kha, and we have dhal. The tongue will stick out when you pronounce it. Dhal. Dhal fatha is light. Dha. So we go from light, heavy, light. Akhadha. I hope those examples were helpful. I want to incorporate practice for those who aren't able to access a regular teacher to help them with reading. I can help with pronunciation and clarifying things as much as I can through videos and lessons. But if you're a beginner, I highly recommend you work with a teacher. Your teacher doesn't have to be me, although we do offer one-on-one coaching on our website that you can check out. But in the beginning, it will take a lot of time, a lot of practice, a lot of reps that you have to put in to become fluent at reading. And that concludes our first few lessons on the single letter. We'll still continue with our beginner level and move on to how letters connect and all the different lessons we can learn from things like sukoon and shadda and long vowels and mats. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video. Salam.